Hello and good evening or good morning or whatever time of day it is where you're watching this. I'm here this evening with my Patrick Eggle Berlin Pro, and this guitar dates back to 1993 when one of the key features was the Wilkinson VS100cv trem, and this particular unit is something which has attracted admiration and frustration in equal measure, because it's a great design, very unique, but equally quite a challenge if you've not got it set up correctly. How this system works is that the bridge is locked when not in use, but as soon as you lift the arm up to use it, the bridge is released so that it floats. So just like that. Now, the key to a well set up VS100cv is making sure there's no change in pitch when the arm is activated. So as the arm comes up, you should hear no change in pitch, but by this point it's released so that it can be used. When it's dropped back down, the bridge is locked in place. And all of this is dependent on a good setup, and it's all about how the trem arm locates in the nut that you can see on the rear of the guitar. Now, over the years I've had lots of people get in touch with me, ask for advice and tips about how to set these up, and recently I've had requests for a video on setting them up. First thing to say is there are different ways of approaching this. What I show you tonight is not necessarily the only way, it's not even necessarily the best way of setting one of these up, but it's how I do it. So I thought if I share a little video with you, you'll be able to see how I approach it, and hopefully if some of that's of use to you, you can go away and apply this on your guitar. So let's go and take a closer look. So here we are at my little workbench. One of the things that I will say is that over the years Patrick Eggle, the company, don't think you can see that, have produced various sort of instruction sheets about how to set this particular bridge up. I have seen numerous versions of this, and they differ slightly from one to the next, but the common feature with the instructions is that when you come to the nut on the back, it's just a simple case of rotating it. But I know that that does cause people frustration. When I've simply rotated this nut to adjust the setup, sometimes they can work loose, or sometimes it's very fiddly to get it accurate. So I thought if I show you how I do it, then you can decide on whether that's going to be helpful to you. So the first thing I need to say is a little bit about the assumptions we're going to make tonight. So the assumption is that the rest of your guitar is set up well. You're happy with the action, you're happy with the intonation and the height of the strings and the arc that the strings take. So each saddle is adjusted slightly in terms of height to make sure it follows the radius of the fretboard. So the first assumption is that you're happy with all of that. One little note to add, if you do end up making adjustments to the saddles, is to say that any adjustments to the saddle, you must loosen these top nuts first. These top nuts clamp the saddles in place, and if you want to adjust the intonation from the nut at the back, or if you want to adjust the saddle height from the two little nuts at the front of each saddle, bolts rather, not nuts, then you must loosen off these little clamps first. If you don't, you risk snapping the mount inside, and that's quite a common problem. So always make sure you loosen these off before you make any adjustments to the saddles, and then these can be tightened back down once your adjustments are made. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the key to all of this is about this locking nut on the back of the cavity plate, and the way the tip of the trem arm locates into it. And that's what stops you from pivoting the bridge when it's locked. When it's not locked, so when you've swung the arm round and it's twisted on this cam like this, it lifts the tip out of that little locking nut so that the whole thing can pivot. Okay, so that's just a little kind of bit of why it works. So I'm going to talk you through the stages of how I set these up. The first thing that I always do is level the bridge. So if we think of this in a number of key steps, the first step is levelling the bridge. And when I talk about levelling the bridge, I'm talking about getting this angle pretty much how we want it. Now the first thing we need to do for this is remove the trem arm, which I've already done, and then remove the back plate. This is always so much easier to do without the trem arm or the back plate in position. Now a really handy hint, and actually this is true for any kind of bridge, and it's especially useful for things like Floyd Roses or anything like that, is to put a shim of some kind, whatever you've got to hand, underneath the back of the bridge. I'm sorry, this is where I came ill prepared. I haven't got anything to hand, but a drinks coaster is really good for this. So you tilt your bridge up, you put something under the back of it, preferably something that is at the right height, because what you want to do is you want to wedge the bridge plate so it's at the angle and the height you want it to be at. So you want it to be parallel to the strings, so there's a little bit of a gap underneath, so there's enough room for upward bends. So put something under there that shims it, and then tighten the 2 screws inside the cavity to tighten the claw, just so that whatever you've put under there, if it's a drinks coaster or whatever it is you've wedged under there, so it's kind of held in place under the tension of the base plate. So that's the first thing you do. Then tune the guitar. So tune it to concert pitch or whatever pitch you're wanting to tune it to. Once it's tuned to pitch, in principle your little shim, your whatever you've put under there to secure it, will still be gripped under the tension of the base plate. At that point, loosen off these screws on the back ever so slightly and keep loosening them until this shim becomes easy to remove. And that's just a really simple way of getting the base plate to sit at the angle you want it to sit at. How many times have I tried to set up a Floyd Rose years and years ago where I've adjusted the claws on the back, I've tuned it, but all of a sudden that adjustment to the claws on the back is wrong because the tuning has added extra tension and all of a sudden the whole thing's pulling forward. So this is just a really handy way of balancing out the tuning against the tension applied by the springs. So a really simple way of levelling this. Get something wedged underneath it that's at the right height, so this is sitting at the level you want. Make sure it's held in place by the tension of the springs at the back. Get it tuned to pitch and then slacken off the springs at the back until you can remove your shim. By that point it should be remaining in tune at pitch, and the angle that you've set it to should also remain the same. So that is stage 1. Now if you've done that successfully, you should now have a perfectly floating bridge that is in tune and that is sitting at the right angle, and without the back plate involved should just work really well as a nice bridge. The next stage is to refit and align the locking nut. So remember, on the back plate we've got this locking nut, and at this point we are going to refit this plate. Now in principle you could have done all this first stage with the plate in place, but I find that it's just a bit fiddly, and sometimes the tip of the trem arm can foul the nut on the back and just get in the way and make it a bit tricky. But at this point you're going to refit this. Now if you look closely you will see there's like a little sight hole in the middle of this locking nut, and by looking through it you should be able to see if it's lining up with the tip of the arm. Now what you want is for this plate, the whole plate, to sit in the recesses. Sorry, I'm not quite the right angle for you here. To sit in the sort of recessed cavity, and you want it to kind of position so that it goes straight over the tip of the arm without any kind of fouling or interference. The way to do that is to I need more hands, don't I? The way to do that is to twist this locking nut. So as you sort of put it into position, you'll be able to sight through it and see, is it lining up with the tip of the arm? Is the tip of the arm appearing in the little hole? And if it's not quite right, you can rotate that with a flathead screwdriver and a spanner. You can just rotate that till it's in the right position. But once that's lined up nice and neatly, it should sit on there straight away without getting in the way of the tip of the trem arm. So by this point you should now have bridge plate that is nice and level at the angle that you want, parallel to the strings with a little bit of movement underneath for upward bends. You should have the rear plate fitted and the trem arm fitted, and in principle the tip of the trem arm will be mounting into that rear collar. So the next stage, to make sure this whole thing's working exactly as it should, is to set the arm correctly. Now you'll notice when I have the arm screwed in place, it naturally wants to hang, and it kind of, even gravity doesn't even defeat it at this point. It wants to hang in that position, and the reason being is that that is the position where it's at its lowest point. When I rotate it, this angled cam here lifts it up, and that's what lifts the tip out of the locking nut on the rear side. So the next stage of this is to adjust the trem arm so that it does exactly what I've just shown you. So let's remove it and I will show you how we do this. I mean, the first thing to say, I should have said this at the beginning under my little assumptions bit, is you need enough visible tip, because that tip is what locates in the locking nut on the back. So you've got to make sure there's enough of that. So hopefully when you first come to do this job, these parts of the mechanism are already kind of in the right position. Now you will notice a little grub screw on the bottom section of the cam. Sorry about the focusing here, it's a bit tricky. That is not secured, so that section will just move around. But this one, the top half of the cam, will be clamped down with this little Allen bolt. So the way we set this up is to, that's the Allen bolt that we want to be working on, not the one on the knurled section, which is the sort of bottom half, but the one on the top half. So the first thing we need to do is have the arm screwed in. It would help if I was screwing it, oh, I'm screwing it the right way, aren't I? No, do you know what, because I'm doing it back to front, I can't work out what I'm doing. Okay, there we go. So we screw it in place, and what we're going to do is we are going to slacken off that little Allen bolt that I showed you. Doesn't need much to slacken it off, just the sort of quarter of a turn will do, and all of a sudden that whole section now is free to move. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to push the arm. At this point it doesn't matter where the arm is because it's free to rotate. First thing we're going to do is we're going to push the arm down, so we're pushing it into the body of the guitar so that the tip of the arm is locating nice and securely into that nut. We want to make sure there's enough depth there. Then the other thing we need to do is make sure that there is enough rotation to actually lift the arm out of the nut. So if we were to clamp it shut here and we wanted to just bring it to here to use it, we wouldn't be having enough lift. You've got to be able to rotate it enough for it to angle on this cam and lift out of the locking nut on the back. So somewhere towards, I'm going to refer to it as a tone control. Those of you in the know will know this isn't a tone control, it's a three-way rotary switch, but it's what we might assume to be a tone control. I'm going to have it pointing roughly towards the tone control. I'm pushing it down to make sure it's locked in that nut on the bottom, and I am going to tighten it up. Again, it doesn't need much, just a quarter of a turn or so. Now it's tight. As I rotate it, hopefully you can see that, as I rotate it is lifting, and there it goes. Now actually I can feel it clicking on the locking nut on the back, so I kind of have two options. If I feel it clicking, I can either lift it a fraction so it's not quite so deep into that locking nut, or I can rotate it a little bit more so that it has more travel. There we go, and now it clears freely without any catching, and it will always rest back to that position. In principle, at this point you have finished. It's set up to do exactly what it should do. But there's a but. There always is a but. At this point, the trem arm, when it lifts and falls from the rest position to the in use position, you should notice no change in pitch of the strings played. You do hear a slight tonal variation, but that's as the transfer of vibration shifts from the locking nut on the back to floating. but the actual pitch remains the same. If the pitch changes, that's not really ideal, because it does mean if you're holding the trem arm in the sort of unlock position, or if you drop it back to the rest position, you will notice those slight tonal variations, those pitch variations. But also there is a risk that that suggests it's not lining up with the locking nut correctly, and there is then a chance that it'll foul, or it won't locate nice and securely, and it won't function as well as it ought to. Now at this point you have two options, and if you read the blurb on much of the Patrick Eggle documentation, or if you talk to other people kind of who deal with these things, they may tell you that at this point it is as simple as rotating this nut. And as I said at the beginning of my this little video, that's definitely one way of doing it. You simply put a flathead screwdriver in there, you use a spanner, and you rotate that ever so slightly just to make sure that the lock position is perfectly in line with the unlock position. Definitely a simple approach, but I do find that when you start messing with this, sometimes it can come loose, or sometimes it doesn't quite go as smoothly into the position you want it to be, so you can overturn it, or it can sort of slip slightly out of alignment. So my suggestion at this point, and it might sound like an overly complicated approach, but it works for me, is if that tuning isn't remaining consistent between locked and unlocked, take the whole rear plate off and adjust the springs, because what you want to do is adjust the floating position by adjusting the claw and the springs inside the cavity, so that it floats at the right position as when it's in the lock position. So if when you strum, if the pitch increases, if the notes get higher when you lift it into its unlocked position, what you need to do is loosen the screws on the back slightly, just a tiny bit. So you're playing a note here, you bring the arm into use and the note lifts or goes higher. Loosen the two claw screws a tiny bit on the back, only maybe a quarter of a turn or whatever it is, half a turn. If travelling from here to here the pitch drops, then tighten those screws on the back, and what you're doing effectively is you're adjusting ever so slightly the angle that this base plate is sitting at, so that you are making it either tilt more that way or tilt more that way, and in effect changing the pitch of the note in the floating position. Hopefully that's been useful. If I've left you even more baffled or confused than you were when you started, I'm very sorry. But if you found some of this useful, then that's a bonus. If you want to get in touch, feel free to reply in the comments. But yeah, have a go. Don't be afraid. Just check that you've got the right Allen keys for these various little bolts. I think they are Imperial, and that can sometimes catch people out. I can't tell you specifically what the spec is for them off the top of my head, but anyway, get in touch if you need to, and I'll help out as best I can. Cheers and have a good night.